It's great to be with you today, and I just so appreciate Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills, and the pastors here, Miles, and all of the others, Pastor Jim, who are making the church what it has historically been in this country, a place where the community meets to discuss the important issues. And I believe that the church, as Christians, we need to tune in to the church, to the Bible, to see what God has to say about these issues and stop tuning into CNN and even Fox. We need to know what God has to say about the issues. And so I'm grateful that you're here this morning. And I was flying out here last night, and I was reminded of a story of these three guys who were sitting together on a plane, and one was a surgeon, one was an architect, and one was a judge, and they started a little conversation. It kind of turned into a friendly debate over who represented the oldest profession. And after a considerable time, the surgeon said, "Well, I represent the oldest profession, and I can prove it." He said, "I remember when I was a kid, I went to Sunday school, and in Sunday school they taught this story from, I think it was the book of Genesis. And it said how God created Eve by taking a rib out of Adam, and he performed surgery. Therefore, surgery is the oldest profession." The others nodded for a moment. Then the architect said, wait a minute. I went to Vacation Bible School one time when I was a kid, and I remember that same story, and it said that God created all of this out of chaos. Therefore, God had to have been an architect. Surgeon said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." Well, the judge was sitting over there by the window, and he started to smile for a minute. He said, "Yeah, but somebody had to first create the chaos." I would suggest to you this morning that the judges in California, and yesterday, you may have seen this in Connecticut, same scenario, 4 judges, 3 dissenting judges, 4 judges struck down their civil union law in Connecticut and is forcing same-sex marriage on the citizens of Connecticut. That's 3 courts, Massachusetts, California, Connecticut, and who will be next? They're unleashing chaos on the citizens of their respective states and potentially the entire nation. I want you to hear me this morning very clearly. I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm involved in congressional races. I'm involved in discussing and looking at the issues in the presidential race. But I will tell you, there is not a more important election that will be on the ballot in November than Proposition 8 in the state of California. You need to realize how much influence you have as citizens of California. I know a lot of people like to joke about the left coast, but it is large and it is influential. No-fault divorce, first passed in 1969. Actually, the second state to adopt no-fault divorce in 1969 was the state of California. Wasn't the first. It's not the first in same-sex marriage either. It's the second. It was the second in no-fault divorce. But within 13 years, all but 2 states in the United States had no-fault divorce, and we have seen the consequences of that public policy. Divorce has skyrocketed, marriage rates have declined, and cohabitation has gone through the roof. Because why? Because we have redefined marriage. And I believe in large part the reason we're having this debate today over same-sex marriage is because the church was silent on the issue of no-fault divorce. You see, God created marriage between a man and a woman. And that is a covenant relationship. It's not one that you simply enter into for a few years or until you're ready to trade in your spouse for a new model. It is for life, because it represents the covenant that God has with the church. And if you see that in the New Testament, where Jesus he uses the illustration of a bride and a bridegroom to illustrate the relationship between himself and the church. Jesus is not going to be cheating on his bride. He's not cheating on the church. It is a covenant relationship, and I believe we have neglected that covenant of marriage in the church. And that in large part is why we are having this debate today. But we're here. We have to realize the significance of this hour. And I am encouraged because I see pastors across this nation. I see pastors in the state of California understanding and discerning the times and realizing that we have to draw a line, and that if we do not take a stand now for what is truth and what is right and begin working our way back to the model that God has established for marriage, that we will lose this nation. The chaos that has been unleashed upon this nation will cause our children to be confused about the meaning of marriage and the fundamental roles of mothers and fathers. That's why marriage is important. And we are going to confuse our children. We're already seeing a generation that is confused, in large part because of our education system. Why do you think we're having this debate? Not only is it because the church has neglected marriage, but because the education system has been training our children now for almost 4 or 5 decades, counter to what God's design is for man and woman. You know, schools are already teaching that homosexuality and same-sex marriage is the same as heterosexuality and traditional marriage. You know, if marriage is redefined to mean everything, ultimately it will mean nothing. And that's what we've seen in the Scandinavian countries, in Norway in particular, where they have had same-sex marriage, de facto same-sex marriage. They had civil unions for about 10 years, and they've had same-sex marriage for about the same amount of time. They have seen the rates of out-of-wedlock births increase in some portions of that jurisdiction to 90%. Marriage rates have declined. There's no value perceived to be in marriage when it is inflated and redefined to mean anything. Of course, in this chaos created by the collision between sexual rights and religious freedoms, guess what loses? Religious freedoms will be lost in America, as we're already witnessing in Massachusetts and elsewhere. I encourage you to go to ivotevalues.org and look at some of the video clips that are on there interviewing the Parker family and others who in Massachusetts have had their parental rights lost. Just this week, that case with the Parker family was turned away by the Supreme Court. 5-year-old son going to school comes home with a diversity book bag that talks about how same-sex marriage is just the same as heterosexual marriage. And the parents objected. Mr. Parker went to the school and talked to the teacher, talked to the principal, and said, look, I just want to know when this is going to be taught so that I can pull my child out. That's all he was doing. The principal said, I don't have to do that, and I'm not going to do it. You have no right to object to what we're teaching your child. He said, look, I'm going to tell you, it's my child. And this was in Lexington, Massachusetts. Now, for those of you who know your history, this is where the shot heard round the world was fired. This is where we as a nation really had our birth. And the principal said, no, I'm not going to give you that right. You don't have that right. And so he said, I'm not leaving until you assure me you'll call me. When he refused to leave, they had him arrested. He was thrown in jail. They went to the state court, went to the federal court there in the state. They lost. They appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And earlier this week, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. That's what you're looking at in the state of California and by extension to the rest of the nation. Now, there are those that are hoping that you and I will be discouraged by some of the poll numbers. Now, let me tell you what. I've been in political life for about 20 years. I've held public office. I've ran for the second highest office, elected office in the country. I ran for the U.S. Senate about 6 years ago. I don't believe in polls, all right? Don't pay any attention to polls. They use them to try and discourage you. Sometimes they will use them to try and make you overconfident. But these polls, you can't believe these polls. But they're trying to discourage us in hoping that we as Christians, because of the changing political climate in America, because of the continuing moral erosion in our nation, that we're just going to pack up and go home, or we'll retreat within the walls of our churches. And I'm telling you, it is time for us to stand. It is not time for us to run. Amen. My wife and I just recently celebrated our 22nd wedding anniversary. And on our 21st wedding anniversary, I was up in Washington. My wife was home in Louisiana. She called me, and she said, you know, I've got some news for you. And I said, well, what is it? She said, well, Looks like